Hey, have you ever written code that was really hard to read or really confusing to maintain? Now, is your solution to this problem to comment every line of code inside of your program? Well, in today's video, I want to tell you why this is not exactly the best thing to do inside of an application, and typically for a beginning developer, this is a bad habit that you should definitely avoid. So hopefully by the end of today's video, you'll come away with a little bit of more knowledge as to when, why, and how you should use comments inside of your applications. All right, so let me get into my slides over here, and let's kind of talk about commenting code and why it can be such a bad idea, especially from a beginner's point of view that's trying to get into programming for the very first time. And the other question I want to answer is how we can actually achieve self-documenting programs where we don't really have to comment on our code at all. So moving on, the question I would like to answer first is why do we even comment our code in the first place? And I think the answer here is we're really trying to clear up the confusion that can kind of arise when others are looking at our code. And the other thing is that we want to make it easier for ourselves whenever we revisit our code in the future. And we want to make sure that we have notes and reminders inside of our program so that we can quickly remember how the logic was implemented. And so everything sounds pretty good, right? These reasons down here are pretty legit and they are pretty valid for commenting your code. So what's bad about this is probably what you're asking, and you're probably saying, surely there's nothing wrong with a little bit of commenting, right? Well, you do run into a lot of problems when you have too many comments inside of your code. The first problem is that your comments quickly become obsolete after just a little bit of your code changes, and it's really hard to actually maintain comments as well because the compiler doesn't actually check if your comments still make any sense when you change your code. And the thing is that developers use comments as a crutch sometimes for following bad practices and not developing code that is well structured, okay? And comments sprinkled everywhere actually makes code visually harder to read sometimes. And so for me, I personally prefer my code to have a lot less comments in it because I think it's much easier to visually parse a lot of lines of code if there are less comments in it. All right, so moving on, I would like to talk about what bad comments are inside of your code here. So basically, I have a function called show, which takes in x and y as two parameters of type string. And all it does is it presents a very small alert right here that has a title, a message, and this OK button in the middle. All right, so a very simple functionality. And this code here has a couple of comments up above to document exactly what this show function does. And I want you to take a look at it and examine what the problems are with these comments up above. So, take a couple of seconds to look at it, and you should be able to spot a couple of problems kind of right away. And I would like to point out here the first issue, which is this returns line, this comment. And if you look at the function show, it doesn't actually return anything. So this comment, while it's still there, it should actually be removed from your code because it doesn't match this function anymore. And so it's possible that someone wrote this show function and previously it did return something, but now it doesn't. So the compiler won't be able to keep up with the comment changes. And the second thing that you probably noticed too is that this parameter list only contains two parameters, x and y, and z is no longer in here. And it says that z is the cancel action title, which is this OK title over here. So this function no longer requires this z parameter, so we should actually remove this comment line as well. Okay, so there are a lot of other problems with this function over here. And the first problem that I want to kind of tell you about here is this show, this name for this function, should actually be more descriptive, as well as the x and y parameters should be very, very obvious what they do. So let me move on to the same bit of code or the same function, but with much more improved syntax to provide something called self-documenting code. So this is the same show function up above. And let's see how I've modified it down below. We say show alert for title instead of just show. So you see how obvious this function name is. and we say show alert for title, and then we specify an underscore title, and then we just pass in the name or the title string for this function method. And then the second parameter is called message. And so you see we have title and message, and it matches the title over here, the message over here for the two parameters that we pass into the alert controller. And so the benefits here is that you don't have to write comments for this second function down below. It's what we call self-documenting because the function name is very obvious, and then the parameter names are also super obvious. Okay, so what you really want to do as you get more experience as a developer is you want to write your applications and your programs so that it's self-documenting code. And so what this really means is that you want to let your code do the talking, and you don't want to let your comments do the talking. Okay, so moving on here, I want to talk about a couple of tips on coding style that can help you achieve self-documenting code. And the first thing here is variable names that are self-explanatory. So in my previous example, I had X and Y as the bad naming conventions. And you want to make sure that your variables, your parameters, actually make sense here. So title and message are much more descriptive and self-explanatory compared to X and Y. Okay, so the second thing is function names should actually read aloud like they were plain English, right? If you have a really confusing function name, it's going to be really hard to understand if you were someone else looking at your code. Okay, so the third thing on this list is you want to keep your functions short. Now, there's no strict rule as to how many lines you should have for a function, but I think anything that is over 10 lines of code, you should definitely consider refactoring these long methods so that you can actually provide more sensible structure for your programs and your applications. And so one big reason for doing all of this is to avoid writing spaghetti code, right? And spaghetti code is a huge topic, and I don't really have enough time for today's video to dedicate to this topic, so I'll probably talk about this later on in the future. Okay, so a couple of things about commenting and documentation is to follow some rule of thumbs here. And the first thing is to not comment the obvious things inside of your code, right? So if something is like, let's say, let name equals David, you don't have to comment what name is. It's very obvious what it does. Or something like let X translation equals 20. X translation should be pretty obvious. Okay, the second thing here is you don't want to comment what your code is doing. Instead, you want to comment only on why you're doing something. Okay, so moving on, I want to show you a list of what I consider good comments inside of my programs. And bug fixes related to underlying frameworks is a big thing that you'll always see inside of code bases. And basically, if you're working with UIKit and you encounter a bug inside of UIKit, you definitely want to leave a comment as to why you're implementing a fix for the UIKit bug. And so something else that I would typically leave a comment for is sometimes I'll decide to go with a more complicated implementation for a solution to a problem that I have. And let's say, for example, I could use an array, but instead I decide to go with a recursive tree for the solution. And it's very important to leave a comment as to why you decided on that logic. And then in a lot of code repositories, you'll find a lot of comments for to-do items inside of the code. And typically, if a developer knows that he's developing a feature and he knows that it's going to be broken for certain use cases, he's going to leave some to-do comments just to warn whoever's going to work with that code later on. And then the last thing that I have on this list is that you want to comment on business logic that isn't obvious to new developers. So let's say you're working on a stock market application and developers don't typically understand how the stock market works. So any feature that you're working that's kind of complicated and that's not obvious in terms of how the stock market actually operates, then you should leave a comment to give a little bit of an explanation. All right, so let me move on to the topic of third-party libraries and why commenting for libraries are actually different compared to internal comments inside of your code. Now, you have companies such as Firebase, Facebook, and PayPal, and even AlmoFire. They all provide you with open source libraries that you can use to integrate inside of your application to make things easier, right? So there's a huge difference between kind of documenting these libraries and making it easier to integrate versus internal comments that you have inside of your code. And so companies like this that actually provide third-party packages, they're going to document their code as good as possible so that it makes our jobs easier in terms of integration. So another thing about good documentation is that it leads to wider adoption of third-party packages. And so to quickly wrap up today's video, I just want to say that commenting is definitely a matter of personal preference. And for me, I prefer less comments, and that actually leads to more readable code for me. I like to have everything well defined, such as variables, functions, and the inputs to all my functions. I want it to be very explicit and also self-explanatory. And then the last thing here is, if you think your code is going to be confusing in the future when you revisit it, you should definitely refactor that bit of code now, because you're going to understand it more now than, let's say, 2 weeks down the road. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed today's video. There's actually much more to talk about in terms of commenting and how to make your programs much more easier to read and also maintain. Finally, make sure to leave a thumbs up for the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye everyone.